Today, Knowledge Exchange Violin comes to the Newark Violin School up in Nottinghamshire in this wonderful historic town. The school is situated in a beautiful Victorian ex-bank building right next to the astonishing, Parish Church of Newark, which is really one of the great cathedrals of this part of the world.
So my name's John Wright and I am the tutor for the first year of the course here. I have been here now for 2 years, quite young to be in this post, but feel very privileged to be here. And my job is to take some students that have either previous experience of violin making or that have come on our level 3 course, which is prior to the first year, and it's to take them on to that next level of violin making. So we would take them through a year of making 2 complete violins in the white, as we say, so unvarnished.
So you're a strange bird in some ways because you're a professional violinist and a maker. How did that happen?
Well, I think one caused the other, and so I was a professional violinist for about 10 years after studying in Scotland, and I think what transpired was I was always more obsessed with the instrument and how it worked than with the music. Now, don't get me wrong, I do love music and I love performing, but there was always more. There was something more tangible for me just about the raw sound and the raw movement of the instrument. So I was always very distracted in rehearsals to the point where it was noted, and it was mostly because I was just constantly reassessing and looking at my instrument and wondering how and why it did what it did.
So what would that? If show me what you.
It would
what
just
would you
be
mean?
to
What would you be doing?
sort of
Show me.
strangely find strange nuances in the sound. So we mentioned you know, anything that would build harmony really would interest me. So just the open fifth and the instrument just starts to sing straight away. I stop thinking about any musical line. My brain is just in a sort of kinetic, how is this moving? So, excuse my playing. So just silly little things like that would appeal to my, I'm not sure, possibly my folk music brain that I had when I was younger, and just something that I know is making the instrument move.
It's interesting that today we would always feel that we wanted to separate the idea of music from the idea of sound. And if I think about what you just played there, just using octaves and tenths and then dissonances, that's very similar to ancient classical music in some ways. We know the ancient Greeks were doing that. But that separation is fascinating. When did you start making?
Officially, when I moved here in 2016, I came to the foundation course here under Anton Gourdon.
So you're an alum of this place?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Were you already a carpenter at this point?
I was always quite, you could say, kinetically minded. I used to work with cars and things when I was younger, and I always possibly nurtured that part of my brain that is the connection between awareness of movement or cause and effect, and maybe how to change things, if that makes sense. It's a bit arbitrary.
So you're talking about the kind of energy that comes through something.
Yeah, I think really that
vibration.
Vibration has always really spoken to me. Even I think my first memory of it actually would be, and this will sound far from this building, but my gran had a cassette tape of the Everly Brothers. And I remember the hearing the harmony.
And the resultant tones.
That's right. So, and then I later learned how they recorded that sort of harmony and why it's much more interesting than sort of multi-tracking and things like this. And then that took me on to things like Simon and Garfunkel, you know. And
doing the same thing.
Exactly, yeah. So that building of harmony. And I suppose the first time I picked up a violin and made a sound that wasn't, you know, from the page, you know, it was just something that it wouldn't have been technically proficient, but it was a sound, and you can't fake harmony, you can't fake that build. So that was probably the start of it all for me. About
the earliest makers who put their names to instruments in Venice, in many ways, who were wind instrument makers. I'm thinking about the Bassano family. The Bassano family were players who were composers, who were makers, and the instruments they made illustrated the pieces that they composed, and they played them. And I love the fact that in many ways, to compose something, to put it together, is not just analog, but at the beginning of actually publishing music, it was the same thing as making the instrument.
Of course.
There's no difference. You know, you put it together, you make it.
Yeah, it's only the years that have separated the two, isn't it? And convention.
You're holding a really beautiful instrument here. What are you holding? And
well, I'm very lucky to have access to this Matthias Albani from the Balsano region in northern Italy.
So that's the Tyrol?
The Tyrol, that's correct, yeah.
So it's Italy, which is almost Austria, basically.
This is almost the missing link between Germanic and Italian schools.
What do you mean? What would be a missing link be? I understand you're making an analogue to missing links between apes and humans, but what would you mean by missing link between German and
interesting, Italy? Yeah, well, I think for me it would be the structure of the instrument and the arching shapes. So on the back we have these curves that are often referred to, we have things like catenary curves, and so architectural terms like this. And
so a catenary curve is curve when you have a piece of string and you suspend it, as opposed to a classical arc of a circle, basically. That's correct.
So we use the analogy of a chain because it gives that idea of some weight in the middle of it, and the sort of the depth of that and where it would end, and that's very useful when we're analysing.
So you're seeing it there.
So we'd see it in the middle of the back. And then arguably we also see it between the widest points of the bouts on the front as well.
Yeah.
So there are different architecture on the instrument. The front, the architecture has to resist the downforce of the strings and the tension. The back, it actually has to oppose it because it comes through the sound post. And the working, the sort of equilibrium between those two forces the whole thing rocks and bursts into life.
And the amazing thing about that, of course, is when that downforce is coming from the front, it's only coming when the pressure comes on the strings, of
That's
course.
correct, yeah.
And the rocking thing is, I love this, the function of these wings here is to enable that rocking to happen.
That's right, yeah. So there's a wonderful thing that happens between the back, which is essentially acting as a leaf spring, you know, like you would see on a horse and cart. So quite real world physics, you know, that they would see day in, day out in these times in Italy. And then we have the same thing of the bass bar. It's carved as a leaf spring.
That run from here
that's
to
correct,
here,
yeah.
basically. Yeah.
So the bridge then connects those two, and those two springs oppose, and this is how we get that resonance, that sustain of a violin.
But also the arch of the front going this way
That's correct.
is more a set of arcs of circles in contrary motions. You have the inflection point between two circles this way and then one going that way.
That's great. We can't be certain of this because the instruments they're so fine and delicate that they have distorted over the years.
How would an instrument distort over the years?
So the main area you would see distortion on an old violin would be in the middle of what we call the long arch, because the downforce. Now, if you don't see distortion on an instrument, it's quite likely that that instrument isn't thin enough to move properly. But on the long arch, we would see a dip in the middle, and then we would see a sort of bulging of the bouts either side. And it would be the sort of thing that halfway through its life, or maybe once or twice by now, it would have been corrected. They would take the plates off, and then they would make a counter form of plaster, and then they would have hot sand, and then they would press the hot sand in it, which would gradually encourage the wood back to its original position. So that would be how we would come back to that, and so many of the great instruments in the Strads that we see have had this done. Now, what was fascinating for me was that my first teacher here, Anton Gordon, he imbued a phrase in us, a positive weakness, right? Which is really wonderful because you can lay that analogy on so many things in daily life. So this idea of it must be able to move in order to speak, which is a very human concept, I think. You know, we have to have space to have a voice, and if it'd be very easy to make a thick violin that was quite even, but it would be very quiet and it wouldn't speak to us. As soon as we start to release the ability for that wood to move, then it starts to speak, which is again a wonderfully human concept. But it has to have then that strength of architecture. So it has to have those geometric rules that you mentioned to support its delicacy and its vulnerability. If that makes sense.
Or you could say, if you want to hold a delicate object, if you hold onto it tight, it's either going to fall out of your hand or you're going to crush it.
Absolutely.
But if you allow it to sit in there, or supporting a balloon on the back of your hand. Hold a balloon, you can't do it. Put it on the back of the hand and gently bounce it.
Yes.
It's going to stay there.
Yeah. Yes.
Used my hands. I've always made things. I'm an artist. So, and I've always found a very interesting relationship, say, between the use of a brush and a pencil, and not as an analog, but as something I do daily, and say, bowing and fingering. And so I'm thinking about what, if you like, consonance or even dissonance you find between, say, the bow stroke and the use of a gouge or the use of a knife or a plane.
I'm really glad you've asked that question because it's something that it's often, I would call it an intrusive thought for me in this building. When I was struggling with, as we all do at the start of a new discipline, to learn to be a violin maker, the bit of my brain that had already been exercised was the bit that knew how to draw a bow and feel the resistance. My hand had a feeling of that when the chisel was moving through the wood. Now, it wasn't perfect, but it was definitely the same part of my brain that was in operation. And actually, I had a similar moment when I was in the setup course in second year.
That's when you learn how to put the pings, bits and pieces on your
Yes,
instrument. Yeah.
exactly. So it turns out that it's a bit of a struggle when you put a sound post in a violin the first time.
Just the first time?
Well, apparently. So again, I had a bit of a hack to this, I feel like, in that I had spent a lot of my teenage years underneath cars with my hands in engine bays in places where I couldn't see. So I would appear, had developed a sort of mind map with what my hands were doing.
And you could work in reverse, effectively.
Without seeing it as well. So essentially, the first time I put a sound post in, there was immediately a sort of a picture in my head of what was happening, and the rest of the class were kind of throwing their teddy out the pram because they hadn't been exercising that part of their brain. Now they're obviously all there now, but it was fascinating for me because it just shows some of those different paths in life that we can be preparing for the next step, which mean we could have violin makers from all walks of life in this country that are already training and they don't know.
We're downstairs in the large room at the Newark Violin School, and I'm sitting here with Steph White.
I come from Perth, Western Australia, a small town about 300 k's north of Perth, and yeah, I'm here to learn to make violins.
What made you decide that you wanted to become a violin maker?
I've always had a love for making things, like creating, be it gluing and sticking, bits of paper and glue and all that sort of stuff. And that sort of just graduated to sort of more dangerous gluing and sticking with power tools, woodworking and such like furniture, carving, all sorts like that. I started carving with a palette knife, a Stanley knife with a bit of palette wood in 2016, and that sort of was like a start of a slippery slope into exploring all aspects of woodwork and this never-ending, all this wonderful stuff to learn about timber and creating with timber.
So with the carving, I'm thinking about the work of yours that I've seen. That was in many ways sculpture, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it was quite sculpture. I've been an artist in the past as well, oil painting, watercolours, all that sort of stuff, and so it's always been from like a artistic sort of, creativity sort of perspective. That's where sort of woodwork and violin making come together with the arts. And
you're coming to the land of someone like Grin and Gibbons, for instance.
Yeah,
I feel
absolutely,
you have
absolutely.
So were you influenced by the work of a great 17th century artist like that?
I didn't know of him.
You didn't know?
I didn't know of him until I got here, and I found out about this guy. I couldn't figure out how to pronounce his name to start off with. So I screwed that up a few times, and this incredible character, and like this incredible carving, which is just mind-blowingly beautiful, and so delicate and fragile and just inspiring. Like,
so literally virtuoso with the knife, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah. You can never make timber do what you want it to do. You have to work with it. It's not something you can tell it how to do this or do that, because it'll always revert to what it wants to be, what it always has been. So you can't fight that natural aspect of things. So it's about learning how the timber behaves and sort of reading the timber, and that's a very, very nuanced thing, very hard to do. Very few people ever master it. You can think, yes, the grain direction is this way, dig your knife in, whoop, no, it's not. So you always get tricked. So the tree always wins. So, yeah.
So what was the first European wood you got to work with when you came here?
When I came here, I was quite acquainted with cherry when I was in Australia. I quite fell in love with that, though, the American variety. I was well in love with English lime.
Which is the Grin and Gibbons wood par excellence, yes.
Yes, I'd worked a little bit with the violin timbers, spruce and maple and such like, but I've really sort of started to explore like English sycamore and more learn about ash and birch and yew. I've never and don't have yews in Australia.
What are you working on right now? What's your focus right in terms of what's in your hands right now?
Right now I'm arguing with a bass bar.
Can you show us bass bar? What is the bass bar?
So bass bar is basically a fancy stick which has to be chalk fitted. So fitted.
Chalk fitted is what means?
Chalk is, we use chalk as a to sort of tell us where the bass bar timber is meeting the front. So we rub the bass bar, and we'll be able to see on the
So
underside.
at the bits where it's not got chalk on it, it's not touching, yeah?
Yep. So we need to take off the spots where the chalk is visible, with very, very finely. You take too much off and you just end up with a big hole in your bass bar. And then
What wood are you using for this?
so this is spruce. This is
The same as the front of the violin,
yes, yeah. You can actually sometimes get the bass bar made from the, when you're making the front, you pull out a bit of timber.
I mean, what's really interesting for me is how, as a player, how I feel that the bass bar is involved in spreading the low frequencies around the front of the instrument. And of course, the crucial thing, of course, because a string instrument is a wind instrument. It's all about making air vibrate. So that's kind of interesting. Is how does it enable this to vibrate freely and then convey sound around?
So this is just a
Like a
little
jacket,
frame, made out of a bit of scrap cork and.
Which you
scrap
make all
lime.
that yourself as you go along.
I made that. Yep.
To what level of finish will you render the inside of the violin?
Yes.
A Testoria looks like someone has finished it with an adze.
Yes.
So what's your plans there?
I mean, it always takes your breath away when you see something that's just really finished beautifully and beautifully done. It just just to see beautiful timber woodwork, for want of a better word, is just breathtaking. I don't want to look like I've just chewed it out with my teeth, but at the same time, there's that question of efficiency and you're making to crude language, but like a tool to be used, and no one's going to see the inside except other luthiers. This is much not an ideal finish for me. I would like to have a much finer finish, it's a labour of love.
There's a slightly Protestant Puritan virtue there,
yes,
isn't there?
Yes,
I mean, that's
absolutely.
what we're talking about here, aren't we?
Yeah. Like good joinery in furniture and such. Like the insides of a joint can be so complex and beautiful, and no one's ever going to see it. The undersides of tables and all this sort of thing, but you've done your best and you've put in the best for that.
So where are we with the rest of this instrument?
So the rest, I've got the start of a scroll. I've just started. Put the peg holes in.
So this is your second scroll.
This is my second scroll. Yeah.
So show me your first one.
First one. Put that one there.
Show me your first one and give your first scroll a score out of 10.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's my first scroll, and it was a very complex thing to try and please to try and understand and then put into timber. To think in 3 dimensions is one of the hardest things.
This is a scroll made by somebody who knows how to work wood in great detail. The thing is that I'm not being unfair. If I met this scroll, I'd say, well, this is a maker of character already. So the wood's not a mystery to you at all. Which side of the scroll do you find easiest?
I am a little bit ambidextrous.
Nearly every maker says that to me.
I can't remember. I mean, both were equally tormenting. I don't know. I'm not sure. I get so lost in the process. I get very confused.
But isn't it interesting where you have something which has degrees of symmetry, but you can't make something simultaneously. You have to take turns, which means there's one side is going to be the leading side, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always going to be like that.
Absolutely.
Like 2 violins playing together. If you think of a line in thirds, if they go like this, it's not interesting. But if they're at an offset to each other, that can be beautiful. So that kind of sense of there being a hierarchy of where you look first. Tell me a little bit about shaping the sides here.
Oh, the edgework I found very, very enjoyable. I really did enjoy it. So Strad, his edgework wasn't perfectly symmetrical.
Well, it's oval in some ways.
Yeah. And it was just the shape was very pleasing to me, the Strad edgework. I think I've mutilated it fairly on that, but like it's just a really beautiful, just to see it like a side profile of that edgework, shaping this edge to give it it sort of finishes the arching and carries the arching, so it just gives flow, and then you round over the edges. It just brings everything together.
Would you say, someone from your in the broadest sense, Catholic approach to making, can you see a way or imagine a way forward where you can see yourself breaking some of the fictive molds of violin making in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's like abstract art. You can't sort of go straight into abstract art. You've got to sort of master
All the great abstract artists like Picasso were the greatest draftsmen of the age.
Yeah,
Exactly, precisely.
absolutely. You've got to master the basics, just form and function, and just to give a really solid understanding of what you're aiming to achieve before you can try and extrapolate from there. So, this is I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, but this is just. I'm trying to really get a deep understanding.
But it's like language, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
You need all the grammar before you then can write different poetry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's really amazing.
Yeah.
I've been here for about roughly a year now, started in the foundation year, and so I'm going on to the rest of the course in September.
Why did you decide to become a violin maker?
So I've been playing violin for quite a while. So basically Hampshire County Council did a scheme where in primary schools you could learn an instrument for quite a lot cheaper. And from there I moved on to area orchestras and county orchestras as well. I bought a violin off a gentleman called Jeff Denyer, and his workshop kind of inspired me to look into the trade, and I spoke to him a lot, and he recommended to come here, and it was kind of been my plan for a while, so I took a gap year to save up, and now I'm here, yeah.
You just started this?
Yes. Working on the scroll, and it's a long process, so you've got to make the templates, square all the blocks, obviously cut out, square everything. But honestly, my favourite part has been all of the carving that's involved in it. You get to really focus on making a pretty shape out of it, whereas a lot of the other parts you still need to be very concise about how well they'll make a sound. I just love how good it looks. It's not perfect, but it's a good foundation to get better on it.
Yeah. So you've been working on this all night?
Yeah. So we started doing the scrolls a couple of months ago, and so we go through them as a class, and so each time we have a new lecture, it will be to keep us up to date and working through stuff, so the teachers are always there if we need help. So you work from individuals, so cutting it all out, squaring it off, and then working on the turns and everything, then the peg box. And now we are just working on the fluting around the back and the front, yeah.
Do you have a sense of where your love is going to be?
Even though I haven't done it yet, I'm quite looking forward to exploring doing the viola, as I play viola as well. And then I'm hoping one day to possibly explore bow repair and bow making as well. But yeah, I think I'll find them really, really enjoyable overall. pretty much everyone really recommended this school, and so do my own research into it. There's a lot of quite famous makers who are graduates of this school. I don't really have prior woodworking experience, and so somewhere like this that offers a foundation year, which you only build one instrument and you get to take a lot longer to do it in, where there's a heavy focus on actually building your tool skills.
Talk a little bit about the tools, because you said there were grants and there were ways of getting...
So I got very lucky. There was an Axminster closing down. I got a lot of tools for very cheap. But the organisation called the Rab Trust do quite, not super frequent sales, a couple of times a year, where because we're students, we'll get half price off the old tools that they have. And then a couple of them, like this knife, is actually from a friend of one of our teachers who was selling a couple of his tools. And so I got a very pretty knife, and after a little, well, not that much work, I was actually able to just reshape the handle to my hand size, give the blade a little bit more of a sharpen. And a lot of the tools that we'll get will need a little bit of doing up because they're very old, but it teaches you a lot about how to maintain your tools as well. And I found that doing it that way, it will last forever. Like, I probably won't need to buy that many more tools for like
So
the rest. So it's a bit messy at the
Yeah.
moment, but that's all my tools. Any tools that we'd borrow from Chris downstairs, the technician, our teachers would show us how to keep them in good condition and properly sharpen them as well, so that everyone was able to use them.
So what do you think, if you are assessing yourself, what do you think of your skills? I mean,
Ooh.
is it coming natural to you, or do you feel that this is...
I'm struggling quite a bit
Yeah.
because I've never done woodworking before, really. And I think it's taking me a good while to get properly used to all of the different shapes of everything. But I think that's definitely why the foundation year has really, really helped me. Like, the teachers properly know that, look, we're not going to rush you through anything. We're going to get you like settled in how to use the tools, what the proper shapes are that you're looking at. And both of the teachers, Ludwig and Carlos, have very much been like looking with your eyes instead of always using like a template. So have either a cast or a poster with you and try and look, so does it look like a nice spiral, or on the plates, does the arching look continuous? And I found that really, really helpful. But overall, I think mine's all right. There's a lot to improve on overall, but it's quite a good foundation, I think. There's a couple small mistakes, like the peg box needs to slope back a little bit. But overall, I'm quite happy with where I'm starting at, to be fair. And I'm going to have some time over the summer to properly work on it as well,
So here we have probably the oldest instrument that the students will ever get to touch during their time here. So the violin is invented by Andrea Marti in Cremona, and the earliest dated examples are 1564 in the Ashmolean, and those were made for the King of France. And we know that they bought some more ones in 1572, and one of the sort of curiosities in this is all of them have had their corners filed off a little bit, so we can have a real degree of certainty that this is one of the ones for the French court. But it's made in 1572, 8 years after the earliest violin that there is, and it's been through a big life. The front got changed in the 1660s. The scroll is much later, but it's an awesome example of what's left after the repairs is a very, very good example of the earliest generation of violin making. The purpose of the scroll on the violin is there's an awful lot to be said about it. I mean, this very beautiful shape which arises is, in order to make the instrument function, you've got to have the strings coming back off the fingerboard at quite an angle. So, although this is a very beautiful aesthetic shape, it's got everything. It's got everything of a very, very well engineered design. This one is it's later and it's not quite so as beautiful as it should be. This is sort of clearly something which has been done rather sort of by freehand. And I think what's happening with when you're looking at a scroll, the Cremonese, particularly early scrolls, are really, really beautiful, and all attention is put into complete mathematical proportion. And I think the reason for that is that actually, when you look at the shape of a violin, we know that there's a great architectural idea behind the way that the violin looks, but it also looks so naturalistic that even for the Renaissance mind, it would be impossible to, it's very beautiful, it's very just, it should have architecture in it, but it's all curves. So, so it's not immediately obvious that it's there, yet the scroll is, it's the emblem of classical architecture. And I think it gives the it's the universal language essentially. So it actually gives assurance to the people who are buying these in the 16th century that this was indeed something which was a sort of classicized form.
The students have very specific models that they are doing and using when they're making a scroll. Is this something violin makers all would have done?
One of the paradoxes about the violin is that you'd have thought that over 300-400 years we would have found more designs. We'd have that sort of creativity. If you look at guitars, for example, every guitar maker has their own design and are able to sort of move forward from early ones. But it's very difficult to find new thinking that is actually satisfactory, and you've actually got a shape which does things so perfectly that it becomes sort of almost illogical to start to mess around with it. And of course you've got such an inventory of great classical designs by people like Stradivari and Marti, all of that, to copy, that even when you're looking at doing stuff which is original, you're still working very firmly within the traditions of the past.
Could you talk me through the varnish? Why is it varnished at all, and how is it varnished? Why is it not simply a naked piece of wood?
I mean, it's the great mystery, and if you have a look at this is a violin made in Cremona in 1572. It's one of the oldest violins that there is, and you've got you've got not just a wonderful varnish, but this wonderful vibrant colour underneath, which comes from the way that the wood's been stained. A violin is something which, in order to play it, your hands will be all over it, and you need to seal it in some way because it'll become very dirty very quickly. So varnish, to an extent, is just simply a protective thing. What I think is very important is with varnish is that the Cremonese varnish, which is very good, sits right on the top of the instrument, so it doesn't actually absorb into the wood. So when you've got a vibrating surface, any change of density is actually going to be a reflective surface. You've got the wood, which is dry, crisp, pure, is maybe 4 or 5 millimeters thick. Your varnish is, 0.1 of a millimeter thick. So what it's doing is it's sort of forcing all the vibration and all the radiation of sound into the instrument because it reflects off the change of density and pushes in. So you've just got some sound which will come off the surface, but everything else goes into this into the box, and it's the way that the air moves in the box, which actually creates your volume and your complexity of sound.
So the neck has a lot less varnish on it.
A long time ago, people would varnish the neck as well, but I think, you know, within 50 years of inventing the violin, I think they realised that the more you play it, the more you rub the neck off. So now you'll the varnish off the neck. So now what we'll actually do instead is just oil the neck. With the heat and sweat of your hand on the neck, you can soften the varnish. Then it becomes tacky and sticky, and then it's unpleasant to play.
One of the common knowledges for any player is the fact that the necks were adjusted, which seems a very brutal act. So could you explain why that was done, and even is there any clue to how they thought it up and why they suddenly did this? So now, obviously, when you make it, you will make it in one piece.
Yes.
And does that make any difference in terms of longevity or even sound?
No, it has. I mean, there are certain things that the neck does in terms of acoustics, and of course it's incredibly important that there's no movement between here and here, because that means that, you know, if you've got weaknesses at the joint, for example, then every time you play the note, the instrument will flex, so it won't be so good. But there's really no. There's nothing really acoustical about the scroll.
This violin, the back, has several cracks or lines. Or is that reason, or is that pretty much as soon as the wood begins to be played?
So this is actually, you'll very, very rarely see violins being taken seriously which have so many cracks on it. But this is one of the. There's about 24 or so Andrea Marti violins from Cremona in the 16th century, and this is a bit of one of them. And we know that it was this badly cracked by the time that the front was replaced in the 1660s. So these cracks have survived that amount of time. It doesn't have its original scroll, doesn't have its original front. This is a 1660s French front. Looking at these cracks, they're the sort of things that you could. It's just not one. It's not quite worth doing the restoration because they've been perfectly good for 350 years. And also in this case, I think, you know, it's all a bit of the history of the instrument.
Well, they're not straight. There's a lot of movement to them.
This has been completely smashed up. So it's
So it would have been in many pieces and glued back together, you think, at some point?
Yeah.
So that was smashed off and
Yeah.
glued back together. And why would the front have been replaced completely?
Well, I mean, to manage to crack the back, you've got to really smash an instrument because it's very hard and very durable. So if the back is this badly smashed, then the front wouldn't have had a chance. So this is a Stradivari from 1685, which is in the collection of the Royal Northern College of Music. And it's a very rare one because it's small. It's approximately half size. One of just 3 of them that exist. Actually, although it's 1685, the scroll is one that he'd saved from an earlier Marti and put on the instrument. So although it's a different maker, it's actually under the same varnish. And you can see, you know, when you look at the scroll properly, you know, as you get right face on the scroll, you can see that it's a very, very, very finely produced Fibonacci sequence scroll. So this scroll must have been made around 1620 or so by the brothers Amati, and I'm guessing that it's a scroll which had been knocking around the workshops for 60 years, and Stradivari decided to use it because it was a small scroll. It saved him from having to figure out how that should look. But it's a very, very good example of this absolute architectural precision. So, you know, you look at the body of the instrument. We now know, you know, somebody in France, Francois Denis, has done incredible work in how the shape of these violins is completely classical architecture, completely derived from Vitruvius. But at the same time as all of that, it's such a naturalistic shape that it's actually very difficult to see that it is a mathematical architectural shape. But the scroll, I think for the Cremonese makers, they wanted to be able to show, prove to people their architectural prowess. So the scroll is absolutely completely done as a sort of a classical sort of tag. It's the most knowable piece of classical architecture. Obviously, you find scrolls in churches and everywhere, but the precision, the mathematical precision that this is done, is absolutely key to them being able to demonstrate their skill. Generally speaking, Italian makers will always get something which is, even if it's much rougher than this, it will always, it will almost always have that geometric sense. And I think that's because they're probably sitting around in church gazing at the scrolls at the top of pillars and stuff like that. Whereas you go to England or Germany, where they simply didn't have this architectural legacy, and you'll see that the scrolls are, much more sketchy, much rougher. Even some scrolls which can be of tremendous fineness in terms of the carving work.
Even after all the Wren churches and the St. Paul and where they where they start introducing scrolls in the churches.
I think it's a lot harder to be precise in this way, and with a scroll actually you can knock out the basic bits of it in a couple of hours. But then whether that scroll's going to take you an afternoon to do, or several days to get absolutely right, is exactly the artist's craft.
What excites you about that violin, but also the Strads as a body of violins, and how do you know that it is a Strad? What stands out?
So this is made in 1685. It's a very, very unusual instrument because it's small, and of these slightly smaller Strads, there's about 3 of them in existence, and one of the very fine decorated Strads, the Cipriani Potter from 1682, this one from 1685, and one which is much later. Stradivari is definitely an innovator in certain ways, and 5 years after this is produced, he produces his long pattern, which is a series of 10 years where he's producing these instruments which are a real breakaway from what Niccolo Amati and the other Cremonese makers were doing. And the interesting thing with this is that I think he was challenged to how do you make a small instrument for whichever reasons he needed to make a small instrument with the power of a larger instrument. And what he's gone and done with this is he's gone and elongated it. He's also being incredibly clever, and this really is a miniature instrument. So working with photographs of this, it doesn't feel like a small instrument at all. The purfling, even the pins in it are, everything is down into a sort of miniature scale. It's irritatingly, it's irritatingly good. In 1690, 5 years later, he starts to react to the new idea of the concerto a tre. So the concerto where you've got no more than 3 instruments fighting against the whole orchestra, and it's very clear that he just increases the size of this, and that becomes this concerto instrument. So this very much, it answers so many questions about Stradivari's process. So I like to, I'm always keen on saying silly things which people can remember, and one of the questions is, how can you tell the difference between a Strad and a violin? And the answer is you tickle the ribs, and because you tickle under the armpits, and the reason is that actually even right the way throughout Strad's process, Strad's career, he just tends to whack the C-bouts in, and you always get a slight break. I've never seen a Strad which doesn't have a slight break between where the rib is connected to the block on the inside and where it's free flowing. So you always find that, and later instruments actually did it with more care.
And it's not on other instruments as much as it is on Strats?
It's it's such a characteristic of Strats. I mean, you see it on many instruments, but the French style of making, which had an external mould, you've got a lot more support on the ribs, so it's almost impossible to break them in the same way.
Is it an early piece in Stradivari's making life, or when did he do this?
So this is actually after 1700. He seems to have really been the head of a workshop, and at this point, this is actually Stradivari, his own, as his own person. This is entirely the hand of Antonio.
Despite that he uses a stroll,
yes,
a workshop stroll.
Despite that he was a little bit lazy. But yeah, it's very important to be able to see how he was working as his own person. All of the golden period from 1700 to 1722 is a group of makers rather than it's his sons working in his workshop. So it's good to see precisely how he's able to work.
This is the earliest surviving English violin of any type, a viola made in Southwark in 1641 by Jacob Raymond, and I'm going to play some French gamba music from a little bit later by Demachy, sometimes known as Demachy-Lisieux, and this is a courante with a double after it. And worth saying, from a making point of view, a doubler is a really interesting thing. You often talk of doublers of variations, but think of how you think about structure internally. You think about the matrix of an instrument and how you cut your way through it. A composer like Bach or these French composers, the way they looked at a doubler, I believe, wasn't as a variation, but simply another way of going through the same matrix. Effectively, construct the shape of whatever you're doing, visit it one way, and then visit it another way.
I'm Paul Davis. I'm from Suffolk in England, although originally from Nottingham, so in a sense I'm returning home, coming back up to the Midlands. And it's been really a very long-standing ambition for me to be here and come to the Newark School of Violin Making. Always wanted to do it. And
Violin making was calling to you, and when did you first have a sense of that, and what was it that got to you?
I think the first thing I could identify would be a trip into a maker's workshop.
Which was where?
It was in Ipswich, a local maker, self-taught maker called Philip Marr, who made very beautifully finished instruments. And I remember walking down the stairs into his basement workshop and just being fascinated by everything that I could see going on there. And it set something chimed in my head at that moment, thinking, yeah, this is interesting. And I'm always, I can sort of trace back to that moment, I think, really, of just seeing a maker at work and seeing violins in bits and pieces of wood that then become whittled away to sort of 10% of what's left, what you start with, rather, and you have this wonderful thing created from these marvellous materials. Yeah, this is the furthest I've ever really got with a violin, this and the twin to it upstairs, which it's a nice feeling to get to this point.
What was the biggest challenge of this, would you say? What drove you crazy?
Fitting the bass bar, actually. Yeah. It's a very complex set of curves to have to fit a piece of wood into. It changes all the way along its length, and it runs from sort of about 40 millimetres from either end. So it's quite a lengthy piece of construction. You can't really see it inside there. That was probably the most challenging part. But yeah, I mean, I look at this now and I see a violin. I think, yes, I've made a violin, but I'm also seeing all the things that I wish I'd done differently, and the errors in it, and the things that don't look quite like the Strad it's supposed to be based on.
How is the neck attached?
It's mortised in, so there is simply a slot cut. There's a block of wood inside both ends of the instrument. One effectively holds the string tension. The end pin, when this is all set up, will be inserted in there.
So that's about this thick, isn't it?
Yeah,
and that also bears most of the weight here as well.
It does, that's right.
Because this doesn't really do any supporting at all, does it?
No, it's a sort of incredibly sort of strong. For the weight and the mass of material you've got, a violin is a very strong structure. Yeah, so you have a fairly substantial block inside both ends of the body, and then you have to cut into it a V-shaped notch, effectively, which has to be at the right angle to give you the correct elevation.
But there is a slight offset between how things were done when the instruments were made, because you're actually making a model which is made already of not the pure instrument. You've got, this is a post-1800 neck angle. This leaning back here is not how the original, this is the Huberman, right?
That's right.
So that would have been flat, which would have mean when you lay it on the floor originally, basically most of this would touch. Yeah. So that leaning back is a product of history, but here you're making it.
Yes, we're building in modifications essentially. What we're producing is not what Stradivari originally would have sent out of his workshop. That would have been very much a Baroque violin, as we now call it.
I'm a classical musician. We spend our lives playing with something which in some ways is a live tradition, but it's a very vestigial thing.
So you have to kind of park all that, compartmentalize it and put it away and think, okay, let's look at this from the point of view of making a new instrument. What works? Yeah. Let's just reduce all of that, get rid of all of this sort of almost the superstition around an old Italian violin.
Around any violin.
Yeah, I think the balance between sort of an analytical approach to, how do you make a good instrument now that somebody will want to own and somebody will want to play, and what you can also learn from the historic makers of the past. It's a little bit of a kind of conflict.
We had this kind of wonderful moment in Washington where we were filming and recording on the 1653 Niccolo Marti, the Brooking, and the 1700 Ward Stradivari. And there was this moment where we were looking at that and we're thinking, well, why does this work? And one of the reasons it works, if we look along here, we have there's 1 year with a good amount of rain and a good amount of sunshine. So that's a really good year. But next to it, there's a couple of tough years there. So in many ways, what's being reflected in this bit of grain here is literally famine and plenty, which are the rhythms of what music does. Life and death, the dark bits of the winters, then there's the spring growth going on there.
Yeah, I've always been interested in the sounds of instruments and why one particular maker or one particular model or one particular school of instrument making produces sort of tonally different results from another. And I think the joy in this profession is that you never really find the answers. Something always keeps you exploring further. It's an amazing world, and some little voice in my head just said, you need to have a shot at this.
You put the fingers there.
And just before you start, Peter, can I just encourage the students as well, when you're listening to the instruments, the different instruments, to try and imagine how and why that we're hearing certain differences in the sound. Try and, even if it's just conjecture, if for the higher frequencies and the speed of his bow and the weight of the bow that he's using, just really try and absorb that as well as the music. It'd be very useful.
So there's nothing I'm allowed to do by myself. Everything. So then you have that really interesting. We've been talking about, what was it Foucault said? There's no such thing as freedom. There are only multiple forms of constraint. Nowhere was that true in what we're doing here. You know, what I do, what you do. You know, the more we lock ourselves up, the freer we can find ourselves.